Hello, students. This is Professor McDermott. Well, as we've moved through the course so far, the thought may have crossed your mind, where is the African American history? But you were too polite to say anything. Well, I have to say your patience has really paid off so far. Paid off because starting with this lecture, African American history will take the central place that it deserves in any course about United States history, and so we'll kick that off with the topic of Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow is a term that we use for all of the laws and customs that created the system of segregation, racial segregation, in the South, but to some extent also in other parts of the country. The rampant discrimination against African Americans and the disenfranchisement of African Americans, that is, how they were deprived of the right to vote. All of these discriminatory procedures together we call Jim Crow, and I'll explain shortly where that term came from. But first, just a little background from the first half of the U.S. History Survey. After the Civil War, after the slaves were freed by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, we have a period in American history called Reconstruction. It lasted for 12 years after the Civil War ended in 1865. And Reconstruction was a time of amazing political gains by African Americans. African American men did get the right to vote thanks to the 15th Amendment. And many African Americans did vote, and in fact, many African American politicians were elected to local, state, and even national office from southern states. And I just want to mention that all of these successful African American politicians and all of these African American voters were members of the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, the party that took credit for freeing the slaves. Although, of course, the actions and the agency of African Americans during the war also had a great impact on that as well. Still, the Republican Party was the party that was friendlier towards African Americans, that by and large favored African American civil rights. And so black voters were Republican, and Republican black voters were able to elect even two United States senators, Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, both from the state of Mississippi, a number of U.S. representatives, and lesser officials at different levels of government. And so Reconstruction was a time of great strides for African Americans politically. However, inevitably there came the backlash to this state of affairs. Most Southern white people really resented the fact that African Americans and Northern carpetbaggers, as they called them, members of the Republican Party who had come down to the South to help administer affairs after the Civil War, were called carpetbaggers. That these people had somehow taken their homeland and were ruling over them and had imposed an alien government on them, an alien way of life. And white supremacists in the South were determined to get that way of life back as much as possible. And so the white backlash against Reconstruction we call redemption. Redemption was a process by which white supremacists, with their political party, which was the Democratic Party, were able to gradually take over all of the state governments in the South. Starting in the early 1870s, this process was completed by the 1890s, and it was helped greatly by the end of Reconstruction, which is dated to the year 1877 when Republican President Rutherford B. Hayes sold out African American Republicans in the South and agreed to remove federal troops from the South. And the federal troops had been the ones who were guaranteeing black civil rights in the region. And so, with the troops gone, redemption proceeded at a much faster pace. And so the Democratic Party was able to reclaim all the southern state governments for white supremacy, and that left black voters in the South in a very difficult position. Some black voters were subject to intimidation and harassment by Democratic Party supporters and agreed to vote Democratic out of fear for their lives. Others were bribed to vote for Democratic white supremacist politicians. There were, still there were a couple of political options for blacks. The Republican Party, of course, but also a new party, the Populist Party, which had emerged, which we have talked about already. In its early period, the populists were interested in openness to African American voters to try to build a coalition of poor whites and poor blacks in the South. But as time went on, the propaganda in favor of white supremacy proved to be very attractive to white populist voters as well as white Democratic voters. And so slowly this harmony within the populist movement between blacks and whites began to break down, and pretty soon blacks were no longer welcome within the Populist Party. Another episode that did not help matters for black voters, in 1890, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a congressman from Massachusetts, proposed a law in Congress that became known as the Force Bill. Now, Lodge was very concerned that blacks were losing their voting rights in the South, and the Force Bill would have sent federal troops back into the South to try to protect black voting rights. But in the South, there was such a huge cry of outrage against Lodge's Force Bill that it really backfired, and it got a lot of whites in the South very indignant that the federal government would try to interfere in Southern affairs and so forth. And so actually Lodge's Force Bill turned out to help the cause of white supremacy in the South. By 1896, it became really almost inevitable that black males would lose the right to vote throughout the South. They no longer had a home in the Populist Party. The Democrats were so strong by 1896 that they no longer needed intimidated or bribed black voters in order to defeat the populists. And the Republican Party turned against its African American supporters. A group of Republicans known as the Lily White Republicans decided that the only way for the Republican Party to remain viable in the South was to get rid of their image as the Black Republican Party, the Black Party. And so even the Republicans in the South began to embrace white supremacy, tremendous betrayal of their African American supporters. And so really, by the end of the 1890s, African Americans had no home in politics. They had no friends in politics to protect voting rights and to prevent Jim Crow from taking root in the South. And I promised an explanation of that term. The picture that you see here on the left, this was an entertainer, a white entertainer named Thomas D. Rice, who traveled around the country in the early part of the 19th century. Rice's act, he performed under the stage name Jim Crow. And essentially, he put on black makeup and he sang slave work songs and also African American spiritual songs to white audiences, pretending to be black. And so in later years, because Rice's act was demeaning to blacks, when these laws began to be passed that were also demeaning to blacks, someone decided to stick that label of Jim Crow on them after this performer, and that's how Jim Crow got its name. Well, anyway, the task of white supremacists in the South to disenfranchise blacks, to take them off the voting rolls, actually was a challenging one because there were two constitutional amendments that protected black civil rights, the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which had given blacks the right to vote explicitly. And so the one thing that never happened in any southern state, no state legislature ever passed a law saying in so many words that blacks were not allowed to vote, because if they had said that clearly, it would have been unconstitutional, and those laws would have been struck down. And so Southern white politicians had to come up with clever and sneaky ways to get blacks off the voting rolls without actually coming out and saying that's what they were doing. And there were a few methods which were most popular in order to do this. One was the literacy test. Now, African Americans had made great strides in terms of education during the Reconstruction period and after, but it was illegal during the slavery time for anyone to teach African Americans to read throughout the South, and so they were at a great disadvantage in terms of literacy, and that was still true in the 1890s. The rates of literacy were still considerably less than they were for the white population, and so by requiring voters to read a passage from a book, or sometimes to read the Constitution, or even interpret the Constitution by taking a test about it. These were methods to try to prevent African Americans from voting. Another method that was widely used was the poll tax, which was simply a tax on voting. If you wanted to vote, you had to pay a certain amount of money. Now, most African Americans in the late 19th century were poor. Most of them were sharecroppers, and many African Americans simply didn't have enough money to pay the poll taxes, and so that was another way that blacks were stricken from voting rolls. Finally, there was invented the institution of the white primary. Now, if you followed presidential politics in the last election, you know that before the general election is held, each party has a series of what are called primary elections in the different states. And this is where Democratic voters go to the polls and vote in a primary to determine who they want to be the nominee for their party. And Republicans do the same. Now, primary elections are essentially run by the political parties themselves, and so this was a case where it was actually legal for the Democratic Party to say, we don't want blacks to vote in our primary because blacks are not members of our party. They were able to determine that, and so that became significant as the Democratic Party increasingly became the majority party throughout the South. Usually the Democratic primary would determine the election, the general election, and blacks were not allowed to vote in the Democratic primaries. However, you may ask, didn't some of these measures actually remove white voters from the voting rolls? Because after all, there were still quite a few whites who were illiterate in the South, and also quite a few whites who were poor and could not pay the poll taxes. And you're absolutely right. Some whites were also removed from the voting rolls, but obviously the white supremacists who were making these laws didn't want that to happen, and so they invented a method to try to keep poor and illiterate whites on the voting rolls while removing poor and illiterate blacks. And this method is called the grandfather clause. And you've probably heard this term before. We actually use it now in all kinds of contexts. We say someone was grandfathered in to something. But the original meaning of it dates back to this period of redemption and Jim Crow. What a grandfather clause typically said was that if your father was if your grandfather was a registered voter in the year 1860, then you were permitted to vote, even if you were illiterate or if you couldn't pay a poll tax. Now, in 1860, every single voter in the South was white. And so this was a way to protect whites in the South who otherwise from being disenfranchised, who would otherwise have been removed from the voting rolls. Now, it's puzzling in a way that these laws were able to go into effect in the South without much protest from the North, from Northern Republicans. Even some very progressive Northerners did not speak out against these methods. Why was that? Well, progressives, as we've seen already in earlier lectures, progressives were very concerned, and reformers were very concerned about corruption in American politics. So they were concerned about big political machines like Tammany Hall in New York City, putting immigrants on the voting rolls just after they got off the boat. And progressives and reformers had been saying for years that they wanted to have fewer voters. They wanted to make the criteria for voting stricter. And so, in a way, these Jim Crow laws went hand in hand with that progressive reform agenda. Also, once the United States began to get colonies, like the Philippines, for example, during the era of imperialism, Jim Crow provided a useful precedent for people who wanted to keep, say, the Filipinos from being able to vote. If the Filipinos complained, why aren't we allowed to vote? They could point to the South and say, well, look, even some of our own citizens are not allowed to vote. And so you can't really say we're being unfair to you, strange as that may seem. And so it's an odd thing, but actually some historians have pointed out that the disenfranchisement laws that were part of Jim Crow actually were one type of progressive reform. And it sounds strange because we tend to think of progressivism in positive terms nowadays, but human nature being what it is, there's never any kind of movement that is going to be perfectly pure. And there's always going to be a good side to it and a bad side to it. And we see that here with the support that progressives showed for these Jim Crow laws in some cases. Another feature of Jim Crow, which is one of the most horrifying aspects of it, was the epidemic of lynching that swept through the country starting in this period of redemption. And of course, lynching is simply the murder of somebody. Usually it happens when people in a community decide to take the law into their own hands, and they accuse someone of a crime, but rather than seeing due process of law take place, they take matters into their own hands and they simply put that person to death. We call that vigilantism. And vigilantes carried out many lynchings during the late 19th and through most of the 20th century. And most of the victims were African Americans, especially African American males. Um, One of the most extraordinary and courageous women in American history was Ida B. Wells Barnett, who made it the goal of her life to try to put an end to this lynching crisis. Now, Ida B. Wells Barnett was a journalist. She was a newspaper woman. She wrote for a newspaper in Memphis, Tennessee. But in 1892, she published an editorial against lynching, which evoked so much outrage from the white citizens of Memphis that they actually drove her out of the city. She had to move to Chicago, where she promptly became the leader of a campaign to boycott the Columbian Exposition, the 1893 World's Fair, on the grounds that it was discriminating against African Americans in employment. And so Ida B. Wells Barnett wrote a number of books to try to raise people's consciousness about lynching, and especially to dispel what I call the myth of the black male rapist, the idea that African American men wanted nothing more than to sleep with white women, and they would go to any lengths to achieve that, including rape. Now, that sort of thing almost never happened, but it was a very, very common accusation by white Southerners and sometimes white Northerners or white Westerners that led to the lynching of African American males. Between 1885 and 1900, in this country, there were around 2,500 documented lynchings. And actually, it's very interesting in terms of Northern support for Jim Crow. Another reason why some Northern progressives supported Jim Crow, and especially the beginnings of segregation in the South, was that they believed that if blacks and whites would be segregated, that it would be less likely that lynchings would take place, simply because whites and blacks would not interact with each other as much. And so some progressives hoped that that would help to prevent lynching. Now, it is true, actually, that when segregation was implemented throughout the South, really starting in the 1890s, this was something new, actually, in Southern history, the idea of segregation between blacks and whites. Systematic segregation, I mean. The number of lynchings did actually go down, but it certainly did not. Lynching certainly did not stop. So, for example, in 1900, there were still 106 lynchings of African Americans in the United States in that year alone. Lynching was really a community ritual. It was a way for white citizens to use African Americans as a convenient scapegoat. To set community boundaries of acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And I want to read you a couple of quotes from this early period of Jim Crow that I think illustrate this. The first is from a white man in Mississippi in 1908. He said, "When there is a row, that is a difficulty or a fight, we feel like killing N-word, whether he has done anything or not," end quote. So you see that lynching became a way for white citizens to create unity among themselves and solidarity among the white community by scapegoating individuals from the black community, thereby creating community cohesion in the white population. Second quote is from an African American male in Mississippi who said, quote, "They had to have a license to kill anything but a N-word. We was always in season." I'm going to show you some very disturbing images now, but I think we need to see them because we need to know that this really did happen in our country, and that it is still a threat. We need to be aware of what happened, and I don't know of any other way to do that than to show you these images. These are images of lynching, obviously. The young man on the left was 16 years old at the time that he was murdered by a white mob. His name was Lige Daniels. Supposedly he had murdered a white woman in Center, Texas in 1920. The image at the top is, if anything, even more horrifying and disturbing. This is the lynching of Jesse Washington in Waco, Texas in 1916. Washington was accused of raping and murdering the wife of his white employer. And here again, because there's this element of rape in the accusation, the punishment was even more cruel, almost unthinkably sadistic. First, Washington was castrated. His fingers were cut off. He was hanged, but he didn't die immediately. In fact, a bonfire was built underneath his feet, and the rope was used to raise and lower him into the fire for a period of 2 hours before he finally died. The next image I want to show you proves that lynching was a nationwide epidemic. It was not something that only occurred in the South. This lynching of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith took place in 1930 in Marion, Indiana. These two men were accused of robbing and murdering a white factory worker and raping his girlfriend. Now, later, she admitted that she had lied about the rape, but it was too late for Shipp and Smith, who were brutally murdered, as you can see. But in this particular image, I want you to take note also of the attitude of the bystanders, and think about how you would characterize it. To me, this is one of the most shocking and horrifying aspects of these images of lynching. I said that lynching was a community ritual, and you see that element here. It's almost like a community celebration. You see people laughing, smiling for the camera. You see people who look like they're on dates, people pointing triumphantly at the murdered bodies of these young men. There's no shame. There was nothing hidden about lynching. This was something that was done openly and in public, again, to enforce terror against the African American community. Nothing at all secretive about it. And in fact, one of the most bizarre and also horrifying aspects of these pictures is that they were actually first created as postcards. Yes, you could go down to the corner store and buy a postcard of the recent lynching in your hometown. And, you know, say if your grandmother was out of town, you could send her a postcard. Hey, Grandma, you missed this wonderful lynching. Wish you were here. Really, really astonishing fact about American history that we must not forget. What about segregation? What were the steps that led to the segregation of the African American community from the rest of the population? Well, the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, led the way in this regard in 1883 when they issued a ruling which struck down a law called the Civil Rights Act of 1875 as unconstitutional. And essentially, in their decision, the Supreme Court argued that the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed due process of law to African Americans as well as whites, only applied to the state governments. It did not apply to individuals, And that meant it did not apply to corporations or businesses who were considered individuals at law. And so this ruling by the Supreme Court opened the way for companies to create separate facilities or separate doors, separate train cars, and so forth for African American customers. And this practice was in turn upheld by the Supreme Court in the very famous 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, Homer Plessy was an African American from Louisiana who got onto a train and was forced to leave his seat in the white car and to move to a segregated car for African Americans. Plessy sued. The case made it to the Supreme Court. And in this ruling, the Supreme Court ruled against Plessy, saying that it was legal to have separate facilities for whites and African Americans in all public accommodations, as well as in public schools, so long as the facilities were separate but equal. Separate but equal. That was the standard that the Supreme Court set. So you could have a segregated waiting room, for example, in a bus terminal, but it had to be of equal quality to the white waiting room. Now, if you've ever been to the Albany Civil Rights Museum, you know that that was almost never the case. And the exhibit there of the separate waiting rooms in the bus terminal in Albany shows that in fact the facilities for blacks were usually vastly inferior to the facilities provided to whites, and that was certainly true in schools as well, in segregated African American schools. Many dedicated African American educators tried their hardest to maintain excellent standards in those schools, but they were handicapped by inferior buildings, lack of money to maintain the buildings. Usually the black students were given the old hand-me-down textbooks that had already been outdated in the white schools. So in nearly every case, separate did not mean equal, but officially the ideology of segregation was separate but equal. Now, as Jim Crow became more and more prevalent and eventually took over the South, many African Americans, in an interesting way, also embraced a type of segregation, or perhaps I should say separation, in the form of the Back to Africa movement, which at its beginnings was promoted by a bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church whose name was Henry M. Turner. Bishop Turner was outraged by Jim Crow. At one point he said, quote, "Hell is an improvement upon the United States when the Negro is involved," end quote. In other words, it would be better for blacks to live in hell than to live in the segregated U.S. under Jim Crow. And so Turner advocated that blacks should move back to the African continent. And this was a theme that was taken up later by other important African American leaders like Marcus Garvey, and also by, to some extent, by figures like Malcolm X, who advocated separation of the black community, building up institutions in the African American community. Not segregation, but separation. And that has its roots in this Back to Africa movement. However, most African Americans did not embrace the Back to Africa concept. After all, they were Americans. This was their home, even though they were treated very badly within that home by the white population. They had never been to Africa, and they were not interested in going to a foreign continent and leaving their homeland. Most African Americans did see America, for all its flaws, as their home. It was the place they had grown up. And so the problem became, how do we survive? How do we keep our dignity intact? How do we fight back, or should we fight back And if so, how? What strategies should be used? And there were different schools of thought about this, and that's what we're going to talk about next. One important approach was pioneered by the president of Tuskegee Institute, which is, of course, a historically black institution in Alabama. You see here a picture of the faculty of Tuskegee in 1902. Front and center is George Washington Carver, the great botanist and scientist. I personally owe Carver a great debt of gratitude because he was the man who invented my favorite food, peanut butter. We have Carver to thank for that. But and many other things as well. But the most famous member of the Tuskegee faculty was, of course, President Booker T. Washington, who had been born in slavery, was educated at the Hampton Institute in Virginia, and had become the president of Tuskegee. In September of 1895, Washington was invited to give a speech at a kind of World's Fair type event in Atlanta called the Cotton States Exposition, and his speech was really the beginning of an era in African American and white relations. Now, Washington presented the platform of Tuskegee Institute, which was that African Americans should seek a kind of practical or vocational education first. Tuskegee at that time was not what you would call a liberal arts institution. It was what we would call a vocational or technical college, where students would go to learn, say, how to be a machinist or how to be a seamstress if you were female. And in Washington's mind, that was a very deliberate strategy for African American advancement. Washington believed that during the Reconstruction period, African Americans had made a mistake by trying to get to the top of the heap too fast, trying to be doctors and lawyers and United States senators. Washington believed that had created the backlash of redemption and ultimately had made things worse for African Americans. He believed that progress had to be slow and steady, that African Americans had to start from the bottom and work their way up, in a sense, to win the confidence of the white community by showing that they were hard and loyal workers and capable workers who could do their jobs well. I won't go into more detail about that because all groups will be reading the Cotton States Exposition address in this module. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions about that. I do want to mention one other aspect of the speech, though, coming from this quote. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. End quote. And if you parse that out, yes, Washington is accepting the practical reality of segregation. Now, obviously, Washington was not delighted by segregation. He was not in favor of segregation, but he was willing to accept it temporarily as a practical reality that could not be avoided for the time being. To be fair to him, he was a great African American leader. To be fair to him, he worked tirelessly behind the scenes to try to overcome the worst effects of the Jim Crow system. But he simply believed that in practical terms, African Americans had to accept segregation for the time being and slowly work their way up, slowly proceed toward getting their rights back. Well, when Washington finished his speech, the mostly white crowd erupted in cheers and an incredibly ecstatic, overjoyed reaction. And it was reported even that white women um, threw flowers on the stage, and white men competed for the privilege of shaking Washington's hand after the speech to show how much they approved, how delighted they were that an African American leader had made this kind of argument. And so, after the speech, Washington really becomes the most visible leader of the African American um, community, partly because his message was one that whites wanted to hear. Although, again, in many ways, Washington did also work very assiduously for the uplifting of the African American community, according to his own strategy. However, the fact that all was not well in the New South became very apparent less than 1 month after Washington gave his speech right there in Atlanta. A race riot occurred in which 25 African Americans were killed. And so, obviously, there was trouble in this New South paradise. And in fact, many African American leaders did not accept Booker T. Washington's approach to things. They labeled it Bookerism. One African American newspaper, the Atlanta Advocate, always referred to Washington in this way, calling him Bad Taste Wash, because they disliked his policies so much. But the most famous of Washington's intellectual opponents was, of course, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. Du Bois was the first African American to receive a PhD degree from Harvard University. He was a trained sociologist who taught at Atlanta University, which is now has morphed into Clark Atlanta University. Du Bois is perhaps most famous for his 1903 book called The Souls of Black Folk, which is an exposition of the African American community in terms of its culture, its systems of symbols, and so forth, and folklore and so forth, trying to talk about the African American community and how it works from within. In 1905, Washington launched a movement known as the Niagara Movement, so called because the leaders of it met on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls to avoid detection. And the Niagara Movement was essentially devoted to defeating Bookerism, to acting against Booker T. Washington's policies, and to trying to take a more militant approach towards protecting and extending African American civil rights throughout the country. And you will read also a piece by Du Bois in which he explains why he thinks this is essential. In 1910, Du Bois was named to the board of directors of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And it's interesting, actually, at that time, Du Bois was the only African American on the board. This group had been founded by sympathetic white leaders who were concerned about what was happening to African Americans, especially with respect to Jim Crow. But Du Bois became obviously a very influential board member, and he became the editor of the NAACP's journal Crisis. And in that position wrote many very important and effective pieces. So you'll have a chance to discuss and debate this fully on the discussion board, this very important debate between Washington and Du Bois, and I look forward to reading that. Finally, we'll finish this lecture with an important symbol of African American resistance coming from the sports world, namely Jack Johnson, aka the Galveston Giant. He was from Galveston, Texas, and Jack Johnson became in 1908, the first African American to hold the heavyweight boxing championship of the world. When Johnson became the heavyweight champion, this caused shockwaves and outrage in the white population, and white boxing leaders convinced the former champion James Jeffries, white boxer who had retired undefeated previously, to come out of retirement so that he could fight Johnson and win the title back for white people. And so Johnson and Jeffries fought in 1910. This was really no contest. Johnson really wiped the floor with Jeffries, won this boxing match handily, and retained his heavyweight title. And you have to picture, people throughout America. This was even before radio was invented. So you have to picture throughout America people gathered around the local telegraph office, getting a blow-by-blow account of the fight over by telegram. And when it was announced that Johnson had won the fight, riots erupted throughout America, in which a number of people were killed because of the anger of the white population that Johnson was still the heavyweight champion. And you see that anger in this headline from the San Francisco Examiner the next day: Jeffries mastered by grinning, jeering Negro. So if the white community could not get rid of Johnson by fair means, they were going to do that by foul means. And Johnson, in a sense, provided an opening for this with his habit of touring around the country with an entourage that was composed almost entirely of white women. Now, obviously, that sent up red flags for white people who were already conditioned to see every African American as a potential rapist, according to the myth of the black male rapist. And so, in 1912, the federal government decided to prosecute Jack Johnson under a law known as the Mann Act. Now, this law is still on the books. What it says is that it is prohibited to take a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. And actually, this law is still very useful in the fight against human trafficking, sex trafficking, which seems to be unfortunately on the increase in this country. But it has also been used against people for nefarious reasons, simply because they violated the norms of the general public, and in this case, the white population. So Johnson was charged under the Mann Act. He was convicted, but very resourcefully, he was able to bribe his jailers and escaped to Mexico. And there he lived in exile for a number of years. And finally, in 1915, Johnson was induced to defend his title in Mexico. But perhaps the whole ordeal that he had been through had taken his toll, and in this fight, Johnson lost the heavyweight championship to Jess Willard, white boxer. But during his reign as the heavyweight champion, we can say that Jack Johnson really became a symbol before its time of black power, of black resistance to Jim Crow.